Great. So good morning again, everyone. I'm really pleased to introduce today's guest speaker, Steve Liedel. He's an attorney with Dykema. Steve has a lot of experience when state government faces a shutdown due to a budget impasse. He brings a unique perspective on what this could mean for not just government operations, employees, but also the public and nonprofits. On a personal note, Steve and I go back a ways. We work together in Governor Granholm's office. And so I'm delighted to welcome today to talk to us about what's going on with the budget and the possible government shutdown. Please welcome Steve Liedel.
Thanks, Joan, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me with you this morning. We'll talk a bit about the state budget process. And I think it's always important when we talk about a process to sort of understand a bit, where does the process come from? Well, it comes from the framers of our 1961 Constitutional Convention, which was enacted and effective in 1964. And that means a couple of things. It's highly influenced by notions of government management, sort of post-World War II, and those around the Eisenhower administration, and sort of, executive management from large corporations sort of at the time. Note that the chair of the Constitutional Convention was George Romney, who was the president of American Motors Corporation at the time. And there was a deliberate effort at the Constitutional Convention to adopt what the delegates on both sides of the aisle viewed as sort of a modern, executive-driven, responsible management budget process. And so we know from the Constitutional Convention that the delegates had some sort of explicit views on what the process should be. There are records of the convention, and here's what they had to say. They say that the purpose and intent of the proposal relating to the budget process is to establish a constitutional executive budget process for the orderly management of the state's fiscal affairs. And they vested primarily responsibility for formatting, presenting, and implementing regular annual budget to the governor, and they, talked repeatedly about it being part of a good management process in public business, right? And so they said that there are four basic essentials to the budget process that they put before voters, and which were eventually adopted by voters and have been implemented since that time. Many of the provisions codified in the 80s in the State's Management and Budget Act into state law, and generally followed, since that time. The first is that the executive or the governor prepares and submits the budget to the legislature. And they impose a deadline for the governor to do that. It's within 30 days of the convening of the legislature, except in a year after a governor has just been elected, it's 60 days. And they essentially required all, agencies of government, universities, the state departments, and even those executives that were separately elected to cooperate with the governor in the executive budget process. And they then required the governor's budget to be presented by the governor in bill form so that the legislature could consider it. That also happened, 200 some days ago, earlier this year. And then they said that the third element is legislative action on the appropriation bills and the enactment of fiscal policy subject to the governor's item veto. And, that's sort of the phase we are in, and we've been in since February, right? It's the legislature's role as a body. The Constitution doesn't make distinctions between one chamber or the other, and no one of the two chambers can do anything to fulfill the legislature's responsibility under the Constitution without the other. It requires joint action by the bodies. And then lastly, it's the executive, the governor, that has the constitutional and other legal duties to administer those appropriations and expenditures in accordance with legislative directives. Right. So, of the four main points, three are sort of driven and led by the executive. The legislature, has one job essentially, and that's to pass a budget. And the Constitution goes on, that it mandates that the budget be balanced. One of the budget bills enacted by the legislature, the Constitution requires that there be a statement, essentially a spreadsheet, indicating here's the projected revenue and here are our expenses. And it has to be done for each fiscal year, right? And so what is the legislature's obligation? To pass, as a body, both chambers, a bill and present to the governor, providing sufficient resources to support the expenses of state government as mandated, in state law by the legislature. The constitutional process that was put in place goes so far to say that the legislature has a duty to impose taxes sufficient to support the expenses of state government that it has provided for. And so we're in that process now of the legislature doing its job, and it does have a deadline under the Constitution. The current fiscal year ends September 30th. And after September 30th, there's another provision of the state constitution in Article 9, Section 17 that comes into play. And it's one sentence, but it emphasizes sort of the shared role of separated powers within state government. And that's that no money may be expended from the state treasury except pursuant to an appropriation made by law. Right. And so a couple of things happen on September 30th. The authority generally to spend any money from the state treasury, and the state treasury isn't just the treasurer or her office. We have essentially one bank account for the people of the state, and that's the state treasury. And as a general rule, any state money is deposited in some sort of account or fund within the state treasury. And any check that is paid on behalf of the state of Michigan, whether that's in the form of a grant from a state agency to a nonprofit corporation, to a payment to purchase road salt for the Michigan Department of Transportation, to a road salt vendor, to paychecks for the elected officials and the folks that work for them in all three branches of state government, the legislative, the judiciary, and the executive. All those payments from the state treasury are made from the state treasury and may only be made under the Constitution, pursuant to an appropriation made by law. And in the old days, it was a lot clearer. Folks in state government employment all received paper checks, right? And whose name was on that? It was the state treasurer, and the state treasurer signed those checks. The state treasurer has a constitutional duty to only sign checks, consistent with appropriations made by law. So that's sort of the lawyerly, structural constitutional process in which everyone is operating. And it does drive, the process and provide sort of the guardrails and parameters around the process. But from time to time, given that the framers of our Constitution vested responsibility for enacting a budget in sort of the most political branch, folks all elected from districts throughout the state in two different chambers, there are political and policy disputes between the chambers. And here, it sometimes leads to disputes over what should be appropriated. It often is more acute in times when there's split control on a partisan basis in the legislature, but it's not always driven by a split in control. I think it's been exacerbated somewhat in the last 10 to 15 years since the state moved to what they call omnibus bills, which is essentially one bill for everything other than schools and higher education, and a second bill making all the annual appropriations for schools and for higher education. In the past, essentially, there was a separate budget for each subcommittee of the legislature, each state department, each sort of general purpose, and there may be disputes over some parts of the budget, which would linger on, too late in the fiscal year. But here, and then, there could be agreement on other pieces of the budget and they would be enacted. Like, for example, you could have a year where, we have plenty of funds in the general fund, we can agree to assign them, but our state school aid budget is a little tight this year. Maybe we'll do other pieces of the budget and leave the school aid budget for later. So there were times, even in the, let's say the Engler administration, where you had one party controlling government and the same party controlling both chambers of the legislature, where some pieces of the budget might not have been done until late September or early October, sometimes even. And I think it's important to dispel the notion of a shutdown. I mean, there's a bit of a perception, at least within the 5 blocks of Lansing, that, there's like this control room somewhere, right? And a big clock on the wall, right? And there's also a very large switch with an on and off position. And if we get to, the start of the day on October 1st, all of a sudden, the governor's in the control room and orders that switch to be pulled, right? And it's sort of akin to scamming a nuclear reactor. Everything in government sort of shuts down and like automatically doors in prisons swing open. And gates are locked at state parks automatically or something. That's not really an accurate notion of what occurs. And what actually occurs is, you have a whole host of state laws that impose duties and obligations on the governor and state departments and agencies to do things, right? And the ability to pay for them out of the state treasury may be limited, given the provision in Article 9, Section 17 I talked about before, that no money may be paid except pursuant to an appropriation made by law. Generally, there are no appropriations, if we reach October 1 enacted into law. All of the appropriations made for the current state fiscal year and all of the related, boilerplate and conditions on those appropriations, they all expire at the end of the day on September 30th. So as a general rule, the executive branch is constrained in spending money after that point without an appropriation from the legislature, but they still have the duty that the legislature and past legislatures have imposed to do a whole lot of things, including the governor's constitutional duty to assure that all of those laws are faithfully executed. And so generally, the ability for state government to operate becomes constrained. And there are a few exceptions. For example, universities have financial autonomy under our Constitution. And so they actually maintain their own treasuries for that reason. And they have their own sources of revenue, right? They have tuition payments and endowment funds, and nothing with a shutdown or a beginning of a state fiscal year without a budget impacts their ability to operate. Now, they do receive state appropriations because there's an obligation in the Constitution for the legislature to support the state universities. But they have all the other revenue, and there's nothing that prohibits them from spending money and going about their business as is ordinarily the case. The Michigan Economic Development Corporation, is technically not part of state government. It's an intergovernmental entity. It may receive some state funding, but its funds as a public corporate entity are not part of state government, and there's no restrictions on the ability of the Michigan Economic Development Corporation to continue to operate. I think next, there are some constitutional exceptions. The courts have determined that the process for funding local roads doesn't require an annual appropriation. The legislature has effectively created a continuing appropriation, which predates the 1963 Constitution. Act 51 of 1951 predates the 1963 Constitution. The courts have found it to be a exception and a continuing appropriation. And so dollars under Act 51, which is essentially state dollars from taxes on motor fuels to support local roads, which I think generally folks view as not sufficient these days, given current needs. But nonetheless, that's an exception. Those will continue to flow. Payments from tribal governments pursuant to tribal compacts since 1984 in the Tiger Stadium case have been deemed, or 1994 in the Tiger Stadium case, have been deemed to be outside of the appropriations process. And to the extent you have, any sort of state agency, primarily it's the MEDC that receives those funds, they can spend them. And then lastly, there are sort of a few sort of public entities that the courts have recognized are not fully subject to the appropriations process. Once the money is there, it's essentially no longer within the state treasury, and certain obligations are binding obligations on the state that don't require and are not subject to the annual appropriations process. And that's primarily much of the funds from Michigan State Housing Development Authority bonds, and then also payments that the State Building Authority makes, to pay rent essentially to the state for state buildings, including those on university campuses. So that's sort of the general process and what happens when you reach October 1 without appropriations. And so what will any governor and administration do in response to that? I mean, we've seen it here briefly in Michigan in 2007 when there was a few hours without a budget until agreement could be reached and enacted on some revenue that was needed for structural shortfalls in the state budget. And we saw it briefly again in 2009. We've also seen states proceed into new fiscal years without budgets in other states, some for extended periods of time. And we also see the federal government often not have authorization to spend money in place when it starts a new fiscal year. Now, that's a possibility here in 2025 as well. The federal government operates on the same fiscal year as the state does, October 1 to September 30th of each year. We don't have any authorizations for expenditures. Not yet clear what the process is going to be for the federal government to reach a budget agreement. So if we do not have federal appropriations enacted into law, there'll be restricted federal government activities, and that could affect the flow of federal funds as well as other federal operations that may impact some of you, right? So, this is a lot of process and constitution and structure talk. Much of this folks outside the 5 blocks around the state capitol in Lansing don't care about. But when state departments and agencies don't have authority to expend money, there's limited things that can be done. The state government, the law is clear, can continue to incur obligations. Like, hey, will you pave this road for us on October 2nd to October 10th? We'll promise to pay you whenever we have authority to do so. hey, state troopers, we need some law enforcement to protect people, even though there isn't a state budget. Will you work on the promise that we will pay you once we have authority to do so? Uh, oh, corrections officers, we might want you keeping these dangerous prisoners under lock and key. Please continue to do those things. Those are all decisions that are placed effectively exclusively in the hands of the governor after October 1. And the governor has a duty to faithfully execute the laws to protect public health and safety. Governors will make that decision. If the legislature doesn't enact appropriations, it's sort of abdicated its role and sort of said, you know what, we're kind of stepping out of government. Because, for two reasons. One, all of the conditions and boilerplate provisions and items that are included in a budget that sort of restrict or modify how the executive branch may implement the laws, in addition to providing them money, those all expire with the fiscal year 24-25 budget on September 30th. So any of those controls that the legislature relies upon, including, for example, there's language in there that gives its fiscal agencies access to government executive branch computer systems to sort of monitor the budget. Those all go away. And secondly, Michigan courts have said that the legislature has a duty to fund the activities it has mandated of the other branches of government. And so the legislature violates the separation of powers clause, when it fails to act. So if you get to the point where there is a new fiscal year and no appropriations, there's only one thing the legislature as a body can really do, and that's pass a budget. Like, for example, it can't go to a court and say, oh, hey, we think the governor is administering the laws and authorizing people to do things and incurring obligations that are inconsistent with the laws or our view of what that should be. There's the law school doctrine of unclean hands. If you haven't done your job, right, which is to pass a balanced budget by the start of a fiscal year, and you're violating the separation of powers clause by failing to fund functions that you have mandated another branch has imposed, a court is not going to help you in telling another branch how to do or not do its job. And so those are all sort of the legal and structural incentives that, make it likely or, encourage folks, our elected officials in the legislative branch, to do their effectively, one job. They have one job each calendar year under the Constitution, and that is to enact a balanced budget, right? Beyond that, everything else is within the discretion of the legislature. There's mandates that they enact laws to protect public health and safety, but the discretion on how they do that is completely, up to the legislature as a body, working with the governor who either signs or doesn't sign laws. But as a practical matter, they have employees and staff, and they might want to be paid, for the work that they're doing after the start of a fiscal year. And so there are those sort of practical pressures that result in, the legislature typically deciding to enact a budget on time, or, if not on time, close to doing so. All right. If they decide, hey, those aren't incentives enough, and they blow past the guardrails and take a turn off the road into uncharted territory, things become more difficult. Once you get about 2 weeks into October, when there are certain mandated state payments or scheduled state payments, arguably there is not authority for the state agencies to cut any checks to anyone. So there are school aid payments that flow to school districts. It's their first school aid payment of the school year for their portion of the state foundation allowance. And if there is an authorization to spend enacted by, like September 17th or 18th. Those payments may well not be made, right? There are payments to local governments. There is a standard, processing cycle. If you have a contract with the state, maybe a contract relating to a grant, it may be other services you're helping the state perform. The state generally is pretty good about, paying those. You submit an invoice, and typically within 30 days, you receive your payment. If the state treasurer believes, look, I don't have the authority to make that payment, that may not happen. And so folks can look to, what prior governors have done, what governors have done in other states, and, what the federal government might do to sort of say, hey, what's going to happen if we reach October 1st and don't have a budget? And let's see if I can add to the chat a link. I will do that now. We know what was planned in 2007, right? When everyone anticipated that there might be a shutdown because the governors was insistent and the House agreed that there would be no agreement and enactment of a budget until the revenue necessary to pay for that budget, given the state's structural deficit, was enacted. And this link essentially tells everyone what happens. Essentially, 2/3 of state employees were told you're going to be laid off, right? The phrase used back then and as a pre-COVID phase, I doubt it will be used now post-COVID. You were sort of deemed essential state workers to provide public health and safety. I think there were maybe, like, for example, 2 employees, maybe 3, deemed essential at the Department of Natural Resources. The number of state cops on the street was reduced from, around 1,000 to around 100. Feel free to take a look at that list. It may provide some guide as to what happens, but those decisions were made for a specific purpose, right? To indicate to the public and the legislature, here's what happens when you don't, collect revenue sufficient to support state government, right? And, things like state drawbridges that were operated by MDOT employees that were deemed non-essential were left open, right? Coast Guard regulations require them to be navigable. And so if you're not going to move it up and down, you leave it open, right? Which created some commuting issues for folks. Folks were kicked out of state campgrounds. That may provide some guidance to everyone to sort of say, hey, I interact with the State Department. Are the folks that I work with even going to be there? But I wouldn't rely on it as a 100% guide, because those were decisions made by a prior governor, in a different context. There was a policy objective Governor Granholm was seeking from the legislature. That's different, from the policy objective that Governor Whitmer may be seeking. It was after essentially 7 years of continuing revenue shortfalls. The first shortfall in projected state revenue occurred at the end of the Engler administration in 2002, in around May of 2002, and sort of each revenue projection period from that period forward, holding things harmless for any sort of structural adjustments in revenue, was down, right? It was getting worse. And then, of course, we had the financial crisis in 2008 that was still exacerbating things until the fall of 2009. So all of the budget tricks and gimmicks and withdrawals from the budget stabilization fund that you might turn to in a budget shortfall where you had a structural revenue problem, those had all been exhausted, going back to 2002. Governor Engler withdrew substantial funds from the budget stabilization fund with the legislature at the end of 2002. The Republican legislature decided, hey, we agree that we need more money. We don't want to do taxes. Let's do these driver license fees that are really expensive, if you have motor vehicle violations. It took the legislature almost, 20 years, 15 years to repeal those, right, when revenues returned. So all of those items are were exhausted in 2007. That's not the case now. The state has sort of seen the first of the tightening of revenue. A lot of it's exacerbated by changes in federal policy that are impacting, both state revenues and revenues the state can expect from the federal government. But there's not, let's say, at this point, a structural deficit. There's budget gimmicks that have not been deployed, and there's a lot of money in the state budget stabilization fund. So this is not a dispute over, how to spend limited resources. It's a policy dispute over, how much state government should spend and what it should spend it for. We'll see if the legislature as a body can address that. A couple of things, and I'll get into questions that are worth considering, particularly from your perspective. Right now, the state is in the process of preparing for a shutdown. They're, doing the contingency planning. And they're sort of deciding, hey, if the legislature doesn't do its duty, what are we going to do from October 1 forward? What's our plan? They're also sort of doing, sort of what I'll call prepayments or pulling payments forward. They're encouraging vendors like, hey, if you normally send us the invoice October 2nd, get us to it, by, September 20th, if you can. If we have authority and money to pay it, we will. Is there any sort of payroll, state payroll, through the pay period, through September 30th that we can process, while we still have authority to spend if we have money in the bank accounts? So I think first, for any of you, note that before October 1, if you're expecting any payments or if you can send an invoice that you could normally send in October, send it now, right? Because you may well get paid. And if there's any sort of delays in October, you have at least an extra month of, any sort of planned state money to rely upon. Secondly, if you have any issues, with state government where either someone in state government is causing a problem, someone outside of state government is causing a problem for you and you need help from state government, or you'd like state government to do something for you or the people that you serve, try and expedite that. Those people may not be available by email or phone once state government does not have a budget for a period of time. And if that happens, there's no consensus on whether it's going to be short or long, right? I think folks that would be inclined to place money on what may occur in Lansing would say, we don't know that it will be expended more beyond 10 or 12 days because it just gets too painful. But I mean, the biggest impediment to this is like, look, if you're a legislative body, you need your staff to pass a budget, right? And if they're not being paid and they're telling you things like, look, my mortgage payment is going to be automatically deducted from my bank account and I rely on my, state paycheck to do it. I don't have it. I don't know what to do. That becomes, a real pressure cooker for legislators and their staff. And that doesn't include sort of the impacts on everyone from everywhere else in the state. I can't get a title for my used car that I just bought because the Secretary of State's branches don't have any employees, or they're closed, or the online system is down and there's no one to fix it. And so there will be pressure to do it. But if there's anything you could do to sort of, if you or anyone you work with, interact with state government and you can get an invoice in now, do it. And if there's any business that you need to do, don't wait. Try and get something in process or get some sort of decision or action before October 1, given the uncertainty that's going to be created. A couple other points. Federal funds. Things get really difficult if there's also a federal government shutdown, right? If there isn't one and, federal funds continue to flow, I expect there may be some dispute on that between the executive and some in the legislature. The many states don't run federal funds through their state budget process. They don't appropriate federal money. It's not state money. We don't appropriate anything other than state money. And, essentially the federal dollars, are many of them already are already pass throughs that just pass through state agencies, or the states have sort of a limited role as a lead agency. I could see, the administration saying, look, these federal dollars aren't part of the state treasury. There is nothing that prohibits us from spending those federal dollars, right? And we're going to do it, right? And good luck finding someone with standing to sue, including the legislature, which has abdicated its role, at that point. Good luck with that. Mackinac Center, what standing do you have? You don't get any federal money. You believe there shouldn't be federal money. You don't have standing to sue. They made and make law that, look, federal funds are no longer subject to the state appropriations process and may continue to make those payments. Back in 2007, in the Granholm administration, it was decided, look, that's what unemployment dollars are. Those aren't state dollars, right? That they are essentially between federal dollars and federal requirements relating to unemployment insurance, and the fact that employers and employees have paid taxes for those specific purposes. We're going to continue to pay unemployment benefits, and like if someone doesn't like it, you can sue us. And in 2007, the courts, at least at the trial court level, seem to recognize that may be the case, that you can continue to do things, notwithstanding there being limits at state government on spending. One of the Detroit casinos sued in advance. The state had taken the position, look, state law requires that you operate a casino at all times with a state inspector present. There's a state employee's offices in each of the 3 commercial casinos in Detroit. And it's a requirement of their license and state law that they can't operate, without those state inspectors' presence. They sued and said, we don't care, if you're not going to pay them to be there. We have rights otherwise to operate, and we don't use any state dollars in our slot machines. And they won at the trial court level, and it was never sort of litigated further. So we may see some litigation over what the state can do and not do. In Minnesota, during a budget shutdown in the 2010s, a number of folks went and got a court order from a county court directing the state to make payments for contractors and certain state employees, notwithstanding the lack of a budget. So that's something everyone should be prepared for. And Governor Whitmer may take a different stance because for 2 reasons. One, what she is trying to accomplish, in this process may be different. She's right now interested in stability, given the fragility of the Michigan economy, due to federal trade policies and other things. She may have much more of an interest in continuing state government. And basically her message may be to the legislature, hey, you don't like it? Pass a budget, right? So we may see a bit of a different approach from Governor Whitmer. I think the other thing is the ability of state government to operate, without people was put to the test in the COVID experience, right? And we've automated a bunch of state systems that used to require a lot more people and paper. Like getting a fishing license, you had to go to a DNR office or a sporting goods store, and like somebody would fill out a paper thing, or be printed off on like a dot matrix printer and that sort of thing. There's a lot of stuff you just do online, right? And what expenditure of state money is involved in that, right? The state certainly can collect revenue and has a duty to collect revenue in a showdown. You've got a duty to mitigate the impact on the tourism process in state government. So there may be some different decisions made on some of those things. I guess my final point would be there are no hard and fast rules. There's an awful lot of discretion vested in the governor. All of her agencies will sort of essentially comply. I'm expecting litigation over some issues on this. And if it's extended shutdown, I think the longer the shutdown gets, the more extensive the impact on folks that normally just expect state government to work, right? And the politics of it will be, changed as well if there is any sort of a lack of a federal budget, because the federal politics will sort of dominate the conversations and the media and social media, and the state government issues will become a bit of a sideshow to the federal process, and there'll be a lot of people just say like, well, none of these politicians can do their job, right? And I guess the one last thing that comes to mind is that this really is a situation where the legislature abdicates its role, and they essentially empower the governor to become a crisis manager and to make a bunch of executive decisions, and also sort of seed communications in the bully pulpit to the governor and her administration. And this is an administration that's loaded with folks, including the governor herself, who's been through and planned government budget breakdowns in the past. And they've got the benefit of folks at the state budget office and all of the information that they've compiled about Michigan and other states for decades about what happens when the legislature doesn't pass a budget and what are your options, and the attorney general's office. There are repositories of information about this that are available sort of only to the administration. So it's a situation where, there generally are no losers, but in other states, usually at the federal level, often the governor who looks to sort of be in charge and not responsible for the situation. Remember, a governor has done her job. Her job is to present a proposed ballot budget in legislative form and sign one once the legislature does it. There's one body, and the public tends not to distinguish between the House and the Senate. It's the legislature, right, that hasn't done its job in those sort of situations. So with that, I'm happy to answer any sort of questions to the extent I can, if you have time for that, John.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Thanks for the background, the framing, and kind of, what are some of the things we can do right now. If anybody wants to put their question in the chat, we can try to read through as many as we can in the next, like maybe 6 to 10 minutes. There is one in the chat right now. It says, is there any sense of what failing to make those payments would mean for Michigan's bond rating and why that might be compelling for legislators to avoid? That's from Cheyenne Tenforo.
That's a great question, right? Look, just the fact that you can't pass a budget in time, may result in either enhanced credit watch by the rating agencies, or a potential downgrade. If they think that the state is not capable of managing its fiscal process. We have a very good credit rating right now, and they cite the state's sort of responsible fiscal management, limited state debt, its ongoing ability, through difficult economic times to generally enact and maintain balanced budgets. The fact that you don't have a budget on time, has an impact. And also note there are costs to that. All of this contingency planning that's occurring in departments and agencies and expediting invoices and payments and that sort of thing diverts from other regular work, right? And there's a cost to that. And then it's expensive to continue to operate without appropriations. Oftentimes you'll have to pay people overtime or back pay and that sort of thing. You may take extraordinary measures to protect public health and safety. And if that's the case, there are costs to the states, and I think that's something that's on the radar screen of the credit agencies. There are certain payments, that are scheduled under, bonds and notes that the state has entered into, and that, there's generally not a non-appropriation clause in those. Like many state contracts include a clause that say, hey, we agree to pay you, right? And we'll pay you on this schedule, subject to, the enactment of an appropriation, right? And that's been litigated. If you're a vendor, even a big one, that has a state contract, and you're no longer getting payments under that contract because either the legislature hasn't funded it or the governor item vetoed the funding for your project or your facility, you're out of luck, particularly if you have a non-appropriations clause. That's not in generally our bond documents. The state has basically said, hey, we're going to pledge our full faith and credit, right, to make these payments. Yeah. All I can tell you is I don't know if Governor Granholm was aware, but I was in conversations with some folks and Treasurer Bob Klein. Notwithstanding the constitutional mandate, he viewed it as a contractual obligation to the state's bondholders. He wasn't going to risk the state credit rating. If we had gotten to the point in 2007 or 2009 where a payment was due, and he had found some way to make it earlier, so he was going to make that payment, and ask for forgiveness later. So yes, this has a potential impacts on the state's credit rating. That is problematic in the current interest rate environment. When interest rates are low, a quarter basis, a half basis change in the cost of borrowing, isn't that significant. Now, changes in your credit rating can have a bigger impact on the interest rates you pay, right? And so a credit rating impact or a credit watch could make things more expensive for the state and all the local units and other governmental entities that borrow money, even for cash flow or for, so ongoing infrastructure needs. That is a risk in a shutdown.
Thanks, Steve. One last question. So it says, could you share what ending shutdown looked like under Governor Granholm? I understand it's not like switching a switch. So yeah, go ahead. It was short term, but what did that look like?
Right. Well, and I think part of the issue in 2007 was that the end of the fiscal year was going to occur over a weekend, or October 1st was Monday. I don't remember which. And the ability to communicate, with state employees and others doing business with state government is a little bit more limited. We were still using phone chains. You call this person, you call that person, because not everyone had 24/7 access to emails. When was the iPhone introduced? I think it was 2007, right? And there weren't a lot of people that had them. You had to have AT&T, and many state employees did not have a remote access. So you began notifying folks and implementing things several days ahead of time, because you had a duty to communicate with everyone, the public and the people that work with you, hey, don't come into work on Monday unless there's a resolution. And so and you had sort of started the process, okay, we don't have a budget on, it's 3 p.m. on September 30th, as the ranger leaves the state park, at 5, 6, 7, whenever, the staffing is done for the day, kick out the people in the campground and lock the gates, right? Because tomorrow morning or the next business day, there may not, that's not appear that we will have appropriation or authorization to spend money. And then 2009 was more of an unexpected shutdown. In 2007, there was an agreement in the spring to raise revenue, including specific members of the then Republican Senate as to who was going to vote for things. And it was just a matter of, getting them to actually do it. There were political perceptions in the Senate that, hey, as long as we hold out and show that, we waited until the last minute, or that she made us do this, that was politically advantageous to us. So that was some of the posturing that was going on. And we knew that posturing was likely going to result in things not being done on time. In 2009, for a little while, the two legislative leaders, one Republican, one Democrat, decided, we don't need the governor and the budget office anymore. We'd rather do the budget. She keeps bugging us about fees and revenue that are likely needed. We don't agree. We don't want to do that. And so they kind of did their own thing for a while till the speaker in the House went back to his caucus and they said, well, you did this and you agreed to all these cuts without any revenue with the Senate leader, but we don't want to do that, right? So he had sort of a mutiny in his own caucus. and they couldn't, get done with the two legislative leaders. That he had to come back to the governor and say help, and the wheels fell off. They got those put together, within a couple hours in 2009. In both instances, you get to a point where logistically you can't pass a budget, right? We're there now, okay, in September. You can't pass a full budget if you don't have an agreement on how much you're going to spend on September 17th by October 1st, right? First, they have to agree on how much as a whole we're spending. How much are we spending from the general fund this year? And how much are we spending from the school aid fund? They haven't agreed to that, as legislative leaders yet, right? And so what happens then? Okay, we have, the major funds, general fund and school aid fund. Okay, how much are we going to spend on each department? They don't have any sort of agreement on that, right? They're not even close, right, on most departments in terms of what the two chambers have passed. So you have to agree to that before you can even begin drafting a budget bill, right? And the logistics take some time. It takes longer if you jam everything into an omnibus bill. And then, once you sort of have those department targets, there's a lot of details within that, like within the DHHS budget. Okay, we're spending X billion dollars, X point X billion dollars for DHHS this year. Where are we spending it, right? There has to be an agreement on every line between the Republican House and the Democratic Senate, right? Before you can pass a budget, right? All of the associated boilerplate and conditions and positions that the Republican House has staked out that they want to take a policy stand on in the budget, and the Senate has those, and then they have to agree what's in, what's out. They have to negotiate all of that before you even have a budget bill that you can pass. And then once you have all those decisions made, then it's going to take several days to draft. And so I think we're likely, if once there is an agreement, just plan on a contingency budget, which is basically typically 30 days at a certain percentage of what was spent in fiscal year 24-25 for everything. That can create issues. We don't spend money consistently throughout the state. Sometimes you got to spend a bunch of money in October and other periods. So certain programs, certain line items, that can be problematic. And so in both 2007 and 2009, even though they had a deal, there was essentially a temporary budget in place for 30 days because they couldn't get logistically the full budget done. And the governor said in 2007, don't bother presenting me, the continuation budget until you give me those bills you promised in June so that we can pay for everything you want to spend for, right? And so at about 2:30, 3:30 in the morning, they passed those revenue bills, printed them, and delivered them. The governor was waiting in her ceremonial office in the Capitol. She signed those, and within a few minutes, the continuation budget bills got to her. She signed those and went home to get some sleep. And then that started the process of notifying, state employees, hey, do come into work. Hey, you can operate the drawbridge again. Oh, hey, you can reopen the state parks and contracts. And hey, spend away in terms of, cutting paychecks and paying your vendors and paying bond opponents. And then over the course of the next 30 days, they worked out the details and passed, a full year budget effectively. A full year budget, whether it's passed on July 1, September 25th, October 1st, or November 15th, once you pass it, it cures all ills in terms of authorization to spend from October 1 through September 30th of next year. So that's kind of the process. Obviously it will be enhanced if we have sort of a limited, lack of appropriations bills. And with the ability to communicate electronically and that sort of thing. But that's sort of the process that unfolds once they reach an agreement and actually present a budget. I mean, just note that, the legislature can throw a lot of stuff at the administration if they haven't reached an agreement with them, right? The governor has the item veto pen, right? And, there have been instances in other states where it's one chamber that's the problem. a governor in Minnesota vetoed the legislature's budget until they would present one that was acceptable to the governor. And the legislature, and this was a dispute within several months, legislators and staff without paychecks, and the Supreme Court in Minnesota upheld the governor's ability to item veto appropriations for the legislature. So yes, it's obviously the legislator's duty, but the governor has a role with her item veto. If they don't check in with her and it's not acceptable to her, they run the risk of those sort of item vetoes and other issues.
Well, Steve, thank you so much. We will all be watching over the next couple weeks. Hopefully it doesn't last a very long time, but yeah, everybody's watching, and hopefully these institutions will start working for us and they'll get something passed and we can get on with our daily lives and our work.
Yep. Thanks to all of you. Let's hope they do their job, and any sort of damage to you, all of you, and the people that you serve either doesn't occur or is limited.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.